Hello, everyone. This is Professor Lopez once again. We're here starting chapter 3. This time around, I'm going to try to attempt to do the whole chapter in one sitting as opposed to breaking them up into two individual recordings per chapter because there is more content that I would like to cover. And at the rate that we are currently going at, I would not be able to do that. So, this chapter is titled Evolution, Species Interactions, and Biological Communities. Now, I do realize that the topic of evolution can be a very touchy subject. Now, while I'm not here to change your mindset on what evolution is or whether you support it or not, but what I want you to do is keep an open mind as far as to understanding the concept of evolution and understanding the terms, of course, associated with evolution as well. And hopefully that'll be okay and suffice you to be able to answer any questions or any assignment that I might have for this chapter. Now, of course, most of y'all probably know that the father of evolution is Charles Darwin. And really, he started a lot of his research when he went to voyage a particular set of islands known as the Galapagos Islands. Now, the Galapagos Islands are a small archipelago of arid volcanic islands. They were very isolated and remote. Now, while even though they were remote, there was very unique type of species that were found in this island. And of course, this is where Charles Darwin revolutionized our understanding of evolution and biodiversity and biology in general. So, of course, while he was there, he found a lot of plant species, animal species that caught his eye. In particular, he found things like the giant land tortoises, which fed on tree-sized cactus. He found unique marine iguanas, and he also found a unique set of birds known as the finches. That while they were very similar in appearance, they tend to vary in their beak size, and that had a lot to do with where they ate. You know, some of them fed on high trees, some of them fed on brush, and of course, a lot of it had to do with the fact that they had to adapt due to competition. So, due to these characteristics that Darwin noticed, he came up with the term natural selection, which of course helped to explain the origin of species. Now, the explanation of evolution by natural selection has been supported by 150 years worth of observation and experiments, and of course, Darwin was the one that started this whole thing off. So we're going to be looking at this kind of stepping stone of the Galapagos Islands to guide us in what we now know as how populations interact and other adaptations that must be made in order for species to survive. So for this chapter, we're going to be looking at how does species diversity arise. What do we mean by tolerance limits? Understanding interaction between two different types of species and how they benefit or hinder them. Understanding why species don't always reproduce up to their potential, and as well as species relationships between not only other species but other types of organisms such as plants and their community. And of course, a few more topics here as well that we're going to be looking at here. So Charles Darwin was quoted as saying, "When I view all beings not as special creations, but as lineal descendants of some few beings which have lived long before the first bed of the Cambrian system was deposited, they seem to me to become ennobled." So, what Darwin was saying was he started realizing these patterns, what we call lineal descendants, and noticing how some characteristics between varying species kind of lined up with one another and showed how they created a linking tree pattern of similar characteristics. So here, because of the topic of evolution, Charles Darwin realized that through evolution, you would have a lot of diversity. So here, the question is asked, why does the Earth support the astonishing biological diversity that we see around us? And what determines which species will survive? And so a lot of this has to do with simply adaptation. And your book says that adaptation is different from acclimation, which is an individual's organism's response to a changing environment. And of course, a lot of us here are quick to adapt. Maybe not so much in the evolutionary sense, but for example, if you live in South Texas, we don't really have a lot of cold winters. But in those moments where we do have cold temperatures, we have the ability to adapt by simply putting on a coat or putting on layers of clothing. So something as simple as that is a good example of adaptations. Now, of course, other species of animals don't have that luxury that we have, so they have to be able to adapt in different ways, whether it be in the way they are built or in the way they respond to different stimuli. And we're going to be looking at that throughout this chapter. and the thing is, once there's an adaptation between a certain species, that gets passed along through genetic traits, and these changes occur over generations of time. It doesn't happen instantaneously. It doesn't happen over 1 year to the other, but rather in decades or centuries. And that's one thing you have to understand when it comes to evolution. It's not something that happens very quickly, but it does happen over a period of time. And so again, this brings us back to the definition of understanding what natural selection is. And of course, this is the process of the fittest individuals passing their traits to the next generation. And so here again, we see the actual definition of what adaptation is. This here, adaptation is the acquisition of traits that allow a species to survive in its environment, and is one of the most important concepts in biology. It does involve changes in a population, and if you recall from our earlier chapters, a population is simply when you have a group of the same species. So like when you drive into BIOL, you see a population sign, meaning that this is how many human beings we have in this town. So an adaptation has to occur in a population, not just in one individual. Of course, it always just usually start off with one person, and that gets passed along to the next generation and to the next generation. For example, here's an interesting adaptation that we've seen that maybe you don't think about very often, and that's the fact that giraffes have long necks, because in previous generations, long-necked individuals happen to have an advantage in finding food and also in reproducing. And so this trait has become what we call a fixed trait in the population. In other words, we see it now as a prevalent trait. And I don't recall ever seeing a giraffe that has a short neck, because obviously having a short neck would not be beneficial for a giraffe, because they would not be able to reach the heights that they need to obtain their food. And so an interesting fact that a lot of us probably don't think about is that these natural selection traits that occur, they happen in the molecular level. They happen in our DNA. And so what ends up happening, we have what we call mutations in our DNA. And these mutations are then passed along. And when we think of mutations in our bodies, we always think of them as negative. Like we think of cancer, of course. Cancer is an example of a mutation. It's a negative mutation. But in some cases, there's a rare occasion where we have a positive mutation. And so like it says here, most mutations have little effect on fitness, and some can have a negative effect, but some have to be useful in helping individuals exploit new resources or survive more successfully in new environmental conditions. Now, obviously, these mutations are not as extreme as something you would find in like X-Men movies, but they are small, little changes that will be proven to be beneficial later on in life. Now, an interesting topic when it comes to natural selection is understanding that species have to live within certain limits. In other words, they have to live within what their environment allows them to live through. We as human beings, we are very adaptable. We can survive in cold conditions. We can survive in warm conditions. But you look at other species of animals, even just around you, especially the ones that migrate, things like birds and other animals, they have to migrate because they can only survive within certain strict limits. And these limits have caused them to have to be able to, move around. And so these limits are called tolerance limits. And this was kind of created by Victor Shelford, who stated that each environmental factor has both minimum and maximum levels, otherwise known as tolerance limits, beyond which a particular species cannot survive or is unable to reproduce. And that's really the key part of any animal is, does it have the ability to reproduce? Because if it doesn't, then obviously their line will die out, and that can lead to extinction. We see this a lot happening with panda bears. We see pandas are very extinct, and right now the key thing that they're trying to do is get them to mate and create more offspring. For example, we see a certain species of plant here that has a certain limit to which it can survive, and this is the freezing temperatures limit in the northern range of the saguaro cactus. Now, usually when we think of cactus, we think of dry, arid climates, places like in southern Arizona or northern Mexico, where most of these plants have to be able to be tolerant of extreme heat and drought, which is why you notice that cactuses don't have leaves. They don't have stems. They can't afford to be giving off their water and their energy to these auxiliary parts. So they have to confine everything to within this general form that you see here. But what's interesting about these cactus is that they're very sensitive to freezing temperatures. It says here that a single winter night with temperatures below freezing for 12 or more hours kills growing tips on the branches, therefore preventing further development, stunting the growth of the cactus. So again, they are more built to survive extreme heat temperatures, but not so much to be able to survive in cold, freezing temperatures. And that is because it has a certain tolerable limit. And so here we see another species where they have a range of tolerance curve. Tolerance, of course, limits affect species distributions. For every environmental factor, there is an optimal range within which a species lives or reproduces most easily. So abundance tends to be high at its optimal range. So we see here when we fall into the optimal range, we see a lot of butterflies in this case. And as we start to go to the opposite ends where we see physiological stress, we see very infrequent amount of species. And ultimately, when we have the zone of intolerance, we see zero species or an absence of species because they can no longer survive past those tolerance points. Now, every species has what we know as a niche. It's here ecological niche describes both the role played by a species in a biological community and the set of environmental factors that determine its distribution. So, for example, a plant has a niche in providing energy to the environment. Okay. Now, of course, we have another term here that you do have to know, and that is habitat, which describes the place or set of environmental conditions in which a particular organism lives. And we've all heard, I'm sure, the term habitat before, and that we live in a certain type of habitat. For example, here in South Texas, we live in a very Gulf habitat, which is surrounded by ocean and palm trees and things like that. That's a habitat. As opposed to when you go to the Amazon and you have jungles and trees that are specific to just jungle-related areas or habitats. So even within a niche, we have what we call generalists and specialists. Generalists often have large geographic ranges, as in the case of the black bear, which is omnivorous and abundant and ranges across most of North America's forested region. Now, sometimes generalists are also what we call weedy species or pests, such as rats, cockroaches, or dandelions, because they thrive in such a broad variety of environments. They can survive in large. You see here the circle that represents the black bear. It can really fill a large region here. And this is why they're called generalists, because they can survive in pretty much very broad condition. And specialists, however, have what we call a very narrow ecological niche. So a giant panda in this case would be an example of a specialist. They have evolved from carnivorous ancestors to almost entirely living off of bamboo. So they've really kind of put themselves in a corner, evolutionary speaking, and that's why they're such a weak species and that they have a very hard time surviving. So to acquire enough nutrients, pandas must spend as much as 16 hours a day eating because they get mostly all their source of energy from plants. And they also have a very slow metabolism, they move slowly, and they have a very highly specialized diet and low reproductive rate, which is why they have a hard time surviving. So again, this is why we call them specialists, because they live off a very narrow niche. Now, here's an interesting principle that the book explains pretty well, and that is the competitive exclusion principle, which states that no two species can occupy the same ecological niche for long. And that is because over time, they're going to start to compete with one another. It says here that the one that is more efficient in using available resources will exclude the other. It's like putting two different people in the same room. They might be able to survive for a certain period of time in that room, depending on what resources are available. But the one that is most efficient in using what's available to them will survive. And the one that doesn't know how to use anything at all will obviously either die or have to dwindle in their size. It says here that other species disappears or develops a new niche, exploiting resources that are different, which is known as a resource partitioning. Partitioning can allow several species to utilize different parts of the same resource and coexist within a single habitat. The best example I can give you of this is, let's say that we have two species of deer, and they live in the same area where you might have a certain type of brush. Well, obviously they're going to compete for that same type of brush. And the stronger deer might be the one that can control its area a little bit better. Therefore, the other species of deer, which is the weaker deer, can do one of two things. It can either die because it can't compete, or it needs to learn how to eat other species of plants nearby that it normally wouldn't eat in order to survive. And so this is what we call partitioning. So here we see an example of warblers that are partitioning. We're looking at a certain evergreen tree. And even with this one tree, we have a variety of species of warblers that have to learn how to survive in certain heights. For example, we see the yellow-rumped warbler tends to live in the lower parts of the tree because it tends to eat off the things that fall on the floor. While you look at the Cape May warbler, lives at the very top of the tree, and so it has to be able to live off of the insects that fly up in that region, as well as the foliage that can be found in that different part of the tree. Now, of course, eventually, when you have certain adaptations that arise from a single species, you might have what we call speciation, which is the development of a new species. And usually they branch off a pre-existing species. And so we see one here, example here in the Galapagos finches. We had speciation occurred largely because of their geographic isolation, because of the fact that they were isolated by a single island. They couldn't fly very far because it was just too much body of water. So rather than flying away to a different island, they learned to kind of adapt to the trees that they had available to them and the brushes they had available to them. So we had what we call speciation. Speciation that occurs when populations are geographically separated is known as allopatric speciation. It says here that behavioral isolation can result in speciation that occurs within one geographic area and is known as sympatric speciation. So you have to make sure that you know the differences between both types of speciation. One occurs when you are separated geographically, and the other occurs when you're within the same area. So, for example, these Galapagos finches that were in the same area together, they are what we call sympatric speciation. They couldn't go anywhere else, so they had to learn how to adapt and feed differently from each other. And so here we see two different types of speciation. See, we look at a single population of, I guess it looks like a squirrel or rodent, and then they are separated by a valley in this case. And so they can actually look a little bit different, feed a little bit different based on the resources that are available to them in their own distinct regions. So you see here in the top image, they had brush that was pretty much all connected together. And they could kind of go in between these valleys and still pretty much eat the same foliage. But when that valley dried out and there was a lack of resources in that valley, they were isolated to their individual little mounds here, which then, of course, led to allopatric speciation. Now, we have another term here called selection pressure. And what selection pressure does, it can make certain mutations advantageous. And so we call this stabilizing selection because it can cause, certain mutations to stabilize the species in their environment. Now, of course, we also have what we call disruptive selection. And we're going to kind of go over these terms in a bit. But I want you to focus on this first bullet here. It says this shift toward one extreme of a trait is known as directional selection. So this is when you have a particular resources that might cause any species to go particularly in one direction. And that's what we know as extreme traits. Of course, sometimes environmental conditions can result in reduced variation in the trait, and we call these stabilizing selections. While other times, environmental conditions can cause traits to diverge to the extremes, and this is what we call disruptive selection. Okay, and the book does kind of go over a little bit on both. It says here, disruptive selection can be observed in the emergence of antibiotic-resistant bacteria and of pesticide-tolerant insects. In both cases, individuals that happen to have better than average tolerance of these compounds tend to survive in a population, while other individuals die off. Resistant survivors produce new generations, leading to a population with the resistant traits. Okay, so the fact that it was being disrupted or being fed medication that normally would kill it, it would have to adapt or disrupt itself to be able to survive these harsh conditions. So we see a chart here that kind of gives us a little bit of a understanding of what directional, stabilizing, and disruptive selection is. For example, a trait such as beak shape can change as changing environmental conditions make one type more advantageous for survival. From an original population with wide variation in the trait, you have environmental conditions might favor one extreme. Okay, so which moves us to part B, or neither extreme, which moves to part C, where we have a stabilizing selection. And ultimately, sometimes it can go work both ways, and we have what we call a disruptive selection. And here it created two distinct populations that were different from one another. Now, because of all these rise of different species that have come from an original species, we have to use this system known as taxonomy, which helps us to better identify certain species. For example, most of you should probably know what our taxonomy name is as human beings, and that is Homo sapiens. Homo represents our genus name, while sapiens represents our species name. And of course, there is no other organism that falls into our category. However, other animals and other plants do have a variation of species, even within very closely related species. And so you have to make sure you know what the term taxonomy is, and that is the study of types of organisms and their relationships. And of course, taxonomists, which are the people that come up with these names, they are continually refining their understanding. But for now, they classify all life into three general domains according to cell structure. So we have three domains that are called bacteria, archaea, and eukarya. And all organisms that are alive today fall into one of three of these domains. So for example, we fall into the eukarya domain because we are made up of eukaryotic cells. All bacteria fall into the bacteria domain, and all ancient bacteria that tend to live in extreme temperatures tend to live in the archaea domain. Now, of course, the domains are what we call the most inclusive organization, meaning that they have the most species in them. And as you move down the taxonomy levels, they become what we call less and less inclusive. Ultimately, we get to the species level. So, for example, again, when you get to Homo sapiens, there is no other species that falls into our category because we are the least inclusive. And of course, every domain has certain kingdoms. So most of y'all probably have heard of the four kingdoms that fall into eukarya, which are animals, plants, fungi, and protists. And so here we see a lineage that shows how taxonomists divide living organisms into the three domains. So we have what we call the common ancestor, which were the first cells, and they broke off until we have these individual domains: bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, with eukarya being the most diverse, which is why you see the most species listed under the eukarya, because, of course, it does provide a lot of differing species. Now, of course, scientists do use binomials to refer to individual species. Binomial, as I mentioned before, is when you have a genus and species name. For example, Homo sapiens. That is a good example of a binomial name. And that's just to kind of give us a little bit of variety and making sure that we don't get ourselves confused with similar species. And here we see an example of that taxonomic hierarchy that I was telling you about. So, for example, when we look at a kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, all the way down to species, they become more and more secluded or least inclusive. So we're looking at the animal kingdom, where the humans, and it tells us all the different categories that we fall into, starting off with the animalic kingdom, all the way down to Homo sapiens. And you see here that we see our subspecies as Homo sapiens sapiens, because again, there are some older human species that fell into our category, like human Neanderthalis, which is the Neanderthal. And so it also shared the same genus name, Homo. But of course, it changed after the species because we're slightly different in our DNA than Neanderthals. This leads us to section 3.2, which is how species interact with each other. Now, of course, the way they interact with each other can have a huge role in shaping species traits and their behaviors. As I mentioned earlier, I'll give you an example of two deers that were really the same species trying to compete against one another. And so that's an example of species interaction. Another example is what we call predation, which is when other species consume or hunt down other species. And we are a great example of that. We are constantly being predatory towards other species of animals, whether they be rabbits, deer, bears, fish. So we have a large role in how certain species interact with us. Okay? And occasionally we have what we call cooperative interaction, where we help each other out. This is what we call like symbiotic relationships. And we're going to look a little bit at that later on in this section, excuse me. So, of course, as I mentioned before, competition does lead to what we call resource allocation. Competition does fall under a certain category of relationship known as antagonistic. When somebody antagonizes you, that means that they're kind of coming against you. And so competition can, of course, lead to that kind of relationship. when you're competing for resources or competing for, even within a species, competing for reproduction. That can lead to competition. So when you have competition among the same species, you call that intraspecific. A good example of that is when you're competing for, again, the ability to reproduce with a male or female. You're competing with other males and females. And when you compete with other species, you call that interspecific competition. And so I mentioned before, other than competitive relationships, you do have what we call predatory or predation relationships. And we only tend to think of carnivores as predators. But really, the true definition of a predator is any organism that feeds directly on another living organism, whether or not this kills the prey. And so we have a variety of species that can eat a different way, whether they're herbivores, carnivores, or omnivores. And we fall into the category of omnivores. And this is anything that eats live prey. So we fall into predators terms. And then we have other types of species that consume in different manners. We call these scavengers, detritivores, and decomposers. And all these three unique types of eaters feed on dead things, and therefore they are not predators because they are not actually hunting. They are simply waiting for other species to come in and do the dirty work, and then they come in and just sweep in and eat the leftovers. Even a simple plant eater is still a type of predator. So we're looking at a little caterpillar here, and it's eating away at a leaf. Now, you might not think of a caterpillar as a predator, but that's what it is because of the fact that it is eating away at biomass. And so they are technically still hunting and killing. Now, not all species have the same predatory stages throughout entire life. Of course, you realize that we change as we get older. We become more independent. So, for example, we see here that some marine animals tend to lay eggs. And so while they're in their egg form or in their larval form, they are now prey. And it's not until they become older that then they can become predators. So we're looking at planktonic animals. They eat each other and they eat other food later on. And they switch to prey throughout the course of their lives. So, that same thing can happen to us. We might be predators towards, a deer, but put us next to a bear and all of a sudden we become the prey. So that depends really on what stage of life you're in. And of course, being hunted leads to species having to adapt to, different selection pressures. For example, a rabbit needing to be faster than a bobcat or faster than a mountain lion. That adaptation had to come by because if it wasn't fast enough, it would constantly be eaten. So then that, of course, leads to the adaptation of the predator having to adapt in order to catch the changes that have occurred to their prey. So this is what we call co-evolution, when two species cause each other to adapt to each other over time. And so here we see an example of another organism that has to adapt in order to avoid predation. We see this little frog here that has developed some chemical defenses in order to keep certain species away and certain patterns as well. For example, when we look at the coral snake, sometimes they're easily confused with the milk snake. And the milk snake did that because it adapted to look very similar to the coral snake in order to avoid predation and avoid being killed by us human beings. Okay, so some examples of prey adaptation other than chemical defenses includes things like camouflage. Here we see a walking stick, and I'm sure we've all encountered a walking stick, and we don't normally see it there until it actually starts moving. And this was adapted in order for it to be able just to be passed by and not think twice about it. Here we see some more prey defense adaptations. In particular, we see what we call mimicry. When somebody mimics you, they're trying to repeat you or copy you. And so here we see a beetle. We know beetles aren't very dangerous, but it has a very similar banding pattern to a wasp. And we normally try to stay away from wasps. So it mimics the wasp in order to kind of fool us into leaving it alone. And another type of adaptation, of course, is what we call symbiosis. And this is a process where two or more species live intimately together with their fates linked. And they are not all the same. Usually when we think of symbiosis, we think of two species that help each other out. However, we have three different terms here that you have to know, and they are mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Mutualism, of course, means that both species benefit from one another. Okay, while commensalism means that one member benefits while the other one is neither hurt nor harmed. I always say that a good example to us of a commensalistic relationship would be if you have a kid. Obviously, the kid, if they're 4 or 5 years old, they're very dependent on their parent to feed them, to clothe them, and so they obviously benefit from the parent. But some could argue that we don't benefit or are not harmed either by children. Of course, that is a very funny way of looking at it, or a very pessimistic way of looking at it. But again, that's a general relationship that can represent commensalism. And then lastly here, I'm sure you've all heard of this one, and that is parasitism, where one partner benefits while harming its host. When we think of viruses, we think of worms inside of intestines. That is an example of a parasite that can lead to damage over time. So this is how we can see how species interact with each other. We see examples between predation and parasitism. They're very similar. Competition are very similar in that they can have effects on multiple species. So here we see some examples of symbiosis. So for example, we see letter A, we see a lichen. This is a mutualistic relationship between fungi and algae that grow on trees. And we've all seen lichen, and they're benefiting one another. And here in part B, we see mutualistic relationship between a parasite eating red-billed oxpecker and a parasite-infested impala. So these impalas can easily get infested by parasites like worms and other larvae. But when they have this bird feeding off of them, they can kill these larvae. I'm sure a lot of y'all have seen what we call cow egrets that live right next to cows, and they're constantly eating the flies and keeping the area clean. And that's also another example of a mutualistic relationship. And then here on the far right, we see a commensalistic bromeliad grow on the trunk of a tropical tree. The tree does not benefit from this bromeliad, but it's not hurt by it either. Okay. And so here we see another term that you're going to need to know, and that is what we call a keystone species, which plays a critical role in a biological community. In other words, they are very important in keeping a certain niche or community thriving. And originally, they were only thought to be top predators, but now we realize that others' prey can also be part of a keystone species. Section 3 kind of goes over some very simple mathematical models that kind of help us understand how species grow and how their populations can either boom or how they can dwindle down to almost nothing. Okay. So here we see, apart from their interaction with other species, organisms have inherent rate of reproduction that influences population size. Many species have the potential to produce almost unbelievable numbers of offspring. This is called biotic potential, which is otherwise defined as the unrestrained biological reproduction of an organism. We've all heard the term, that rabbits can reproduce like crazy. And so this is what we call their biotic potential, the fact that they can actually produce a lot of offspring over a short period of time. So a growth without limits, of course, is known as exponential growth. So your exponential growth is a population growth with no limits and has a distinctive shaped J growth curve when graphed over time. So in other words, you start off with a very small population, but give it enough time, and that little line just kind of shoots upward in the shape of a J, showing that there's a constant growth of species. Now, this J curve only usually occurs in what we call in ideal situations, where certain species are not being preyed upon. They have enough resources to continue to survive. So, of course, you're going to see a continual J curve. But most species do not live in this J curve environment. Okay. So here we see an example of a J curve where we see an increase in moose. And they are crossing what we call the carrying capacity. Carrying capacity refers to how much resources are available. Once you pass that carrying capacity, you will have what we call a dieback. You will have the J curve dropping down inversely. And you see that carrying capacity will rise and fall depending on how many moose are available. So the more moose you have, the less resources you have. When that moose population drops down dramatically, then it allows for the resources to kind of replenish themselves, which then, of course, has a yo-yo effect, leading to a rise once again in the population of moose. And this continues, again and again and again until either one of those stops responding to that curve. So as I mentioned before, in the real world, we have what we call limits to growth. And this is what we call the carrying capacity. This is defined as the number or biomass of animals that can be supported within a certain area of habitat without harvesting. And this is very easily represented by this particular image here that shows what a carrying capacity looks like. Every time they cross it, it leads to a change in the availability of moose in this case. It's here that when a population overshoots the carrying capacity of its environment, resources become limited and death rates rise and the population may crash. And so here we see what that curve would look like when you have interaction between predator and prey. Now here we see a reddish line that represents the snowshoe hare and a yellowish orange line that represents the lynx. And you see how they interact with one another. When there is a rise in hare, there's a slow rise in lynx. However, the more the lynx rises, that leads to a negative effect on the rabbit. So there's this yo-yo effect that happens every time there's a rise or fall in a prey or predator population. So when a predator population falls, that allows for more prey to rise up again. And when more prey rise up again, it allows for more food to be found for the predator. And so that just continues and continues and continues throughout this lifespan. So what's really important to understand is not all biological population cycles lead to what we call exponential overshoot or catastrophic dieback. Sometimes what happens is we have internal and external factors that can bring a species to what we call equilibrium, to a balance. And so when resources are unlimited, they may grow exponentially, but this growth slows as the carrying capacity, of course, is approached. And so we call this a logistic growth because of its changes in growth over time. And you see the word there, dynamic. Dynamic means that there's a constant change occurring. And so we saw this in the previous image when you see that there's a constant change always occurring depending on whether or not there is a lot of predators or a lot of preys. They sync up with each other. And so here we see what we call an S-shaped logistic growth curve. So we see that the logistic growth curve has a different shape than the exponential growth curve. The exponential growth always looks like a J, as I mentioned before. Here, a logistic growth curve looks more like an S. We call it an S curve. It describes a population whose growth rate decreases if its numbers approach or exceed the carrying capacity of the environment. Now, as I mentioned before, population growth rates are affected by external and internal factors. External factors are habitat quality, food availability, and interaction with other organisms. As populations grow, food becomes scarcer and competition for resources become more intense. With a larger population, there's an increased risk that disease or parasites will spread or that predators will be attracted to the area. Some organisms become physiologically stressed, as we saw earlier, when their conditions are crowded. But other internal factors of maturity, body size, and hormonal status may cause them to reduce their reproductive output. For example, when you have an overcrowded house of mice, for instance, you have an average of 5.1 babies per litter, while uncrowded houses tend to have 6.2 babies per litter. So that shows how crowding can have an effect on the amount of species created through reproduction. So all these factors are what we call density dependent. So in other words, what happens is as population size increases, the effect intensifies. And when you have density independent factors, a population is affected no matter what its size. So for example, drought and early killing frost, flooding, landslide, or habitat destruction by people, they all increase mortality rates regardless of the population size. So density independent limits to population are often non-biological. They are actually acts of nature. And of course, different species respond to different factors a little bit differently. So some organisms such as dandelions and barnacles, they depend on a high rate of reproduction because there's always constant death. So the only way they can survive is to make sure that they have a lot of offspring. So these organisms are what we call R-selected species because they are adapted to employ a high reproductive rate. Again, we think of rabbits, we think of mice. They have very high reproductive rates because they have a lot of death. They're constantly being eaten or dying due to starvation because they lack resources, things like that. However, organisms that reproduce more conservatively with longer generation times, late sexual maturity, fewer young, are often referred to as K-selected species. They are adapted for slower growth conditions near the carrying capacity. So I would venture to say that we as human beings, we probably fall under the K-selected species because we reproduce very conservatively. We only have about 1, 2 to 3 children maybe. And we also mature sexually in a very late stage. Obviously, a lot of us don't start maturing sexually till either our teenage years or even beyond that. And we have very long generation times, meaning we last a very long time. So that we all fall into these different factors that fall under the K-selected species. And again, we see some examples of both R-selected species and K-selected species and what roles fall into each of these. And again, if you look at more at the K-selected species, you can probably tell that we fall into this for sure. And here we see an image that shows us survivorship curves. Idealized survivorship curves include high survival rate for juveniles, which is we're looking at the type 1. They also have uniform mortality risk throughout life, which is type 2. And there are also some that have high mortality for juveniles with long survival for few individuals that reach maturity. We see type 3. So I would venture to say that we fall under type 2, which is we have individuals dying at a uniform rate, constantly. But of course, we can also fall into the type 1 as well, which is we have people that die later on in life. This takes us to section number 4, which talks about community diversity, meaning how diverse we can be even within a small region. It says here that no species is an island. It always lives with other species in a biological community in a particular environment. This goes even for us human beings. We don't live alone. We're not just living in a town of people, but we live in a town that has certain plants, certain bodies of water, certain animals that live nearby us. So this all plays a role in creating the community that we live in. Now, in this section, of course, we'll consider how the many species in an area together produce the basic properties of biological communities and ecosystems. And the reason why we look at this is to see, what kind of diversity, what kind of abundance there is between species, and of course, what kind of structure these variety of species cause in a community. So number 1, we're looking at diversity and abundance. Diversity is defined as the number of different species in an area or the number per unit area. Now, obviously, here in BIOL, I wouldn't say that we're very diverse, but you look at a region like the jungles of the Amazon, and they have a lot of different species living in that small area. So you could call that a very diverse area. Abundance, again, refers to the number of individuals of a particular species. So you could say that we have an abundance of human beings, or Homo sapiens. While we might not be very diverse, we are definitely very abundant. Now, of course, some of these terms can be related, of course, depending on where it is that you're referring to. Since your communities with high diversity often have few individuals of any one species. Most communities contain a few common species and many rare ones. Now, when you have community structure, or otherwise known as spatial patterns, they can be random, ordered, or patchy. In other words, the communities are built a little bit differently. When you have randomly distributed populations, you have individuals that live wherever resources are available, and chance events allow them to settle. So we as human beings tend to live sometimes in randomly distributed populations, especially back in the early days. When you look at maps of the 1800s, you see how cities were very, very randomly distributed because they were really kind of going off of where resources were available, near rivers, near lush vegetation, things like that. And of course, we have another pattern here that's titled ordered or uniform, which usually arise from competition and territoriality. You see this a lot more in the wild, where you have, again, they're competing for resources, they're competing for territory, and so they're very ordered. And of course, the last one here, we have patchy patterns, which result when species clump together for protection, mutual assistance, or reproduction. And we see a lot of this in animals that live in packs. They are what we call a patchy pattern because they are living together really for protection and to be able to feed one another. For example, one member of a species might be lucky in finding prey, and so therefore they have to share that meal with their other partners around them, and so which leads to a patchy pattern. And so here we see some examples of population distribution that can be random, for example, in part A, and then we see also uniform, part B, where we see certain penguins all living together in a uniform, ordered state because of their environment. And of course, we see cluster. We have schools of fish living close to one another in order to keep themselves protected. And one interesting thing about communities, of course, is they can also be distributed vertically. We tend to think of communities in a very horizontal plane, but of course, when you look at a plant or a tree, as we saw earlier with the finches diagram, we can have a variety of species living just within one single tree. In a jungle, in particular, we have insects, reptiles, monkeys, birds, even certain felines that all live within one particular tree that can be very, very big. And that just shows how diverse it can be, even just in a vertical population. And so here we see other terminology that refers to communities that form patterns in landscapes. So, for example, we have the word core habitat, which refers to a large patch of relatively uniform environment that is free of the influences of edges. Now, what are edges? Well, edge effects are where communities meet, and the environmental conditions blend, and species and microclimate of one community can penetrate the other. So it looks very similar to what I would say like a Venn diagram. If you've ever seen what a Venn diagram looks like, you have a merging of similar characteristics, certain environmental resources, and that leads to what we call edge effects. So here we see the edge between a lake, a wetland, and a forest. And so here we see a very patchy look, but yet all these three different types of environmental factors kind of bleed into one another to form this edge effect. And of course, shape can also influence the availability of core area in a habitat or a preserve. So, the shape of a certain environmental region can have a huge effect in how resources are distributed. Now, there was a certain ecologist by the name of Robert MacArthur who proposed that the more complexity a community possesses, the more resilient it is when disturbance strikes. He reasoned that if many different species occupy each trophic level, some can fill in if others are stressed or eliminated by external forces. The whole community has what we call resilience and either resists or recovers quickly from disturbance. Often we do think of diversity in terms of species counts, but another aspect of community is complexity. Complexity, of course, refers to the number of trophic levels in the community and to the number of species at each of these trophic levels. A complex community might have many trophic levels and groups of species performing the same functions. Another factor that contributes to resilience is, of course, known as productivity. And we have different forms of productivity here. It says here primary productivity is the production of biomass by photosynthesis. And we usually call these primary producers, think like plants, algae, some bacteria. They all produce photosynthesis by converting sunlight energy into chemical energy. And of course, we can measure primary productivity in terms of units of biomass per unit area per year. For example, in grams per square meter per year. Because cellular respiration is in producing organisms uses much of that energy, a more useful term is net primary productivity, or the amount of biomass stored after respiration. Because you got to remember that when we eat a plant like a lettuce or a cucumber or anything like that, we're not really obtaining the full energy that that plant originally made. So what energy we do get is known as net primary productivity. Now, of course, it's going to be different when it comes to primary productivity. It's going to be very different depending on where you're at. Whether it's underwater, on shore beds, in forests, in jungles, or in the mountains, deserts. All these different factors can play a huge role in how much biomass you accumulate. Differences in net primary production is chiefly due to temperature, rainfall, and nutrients that are available to them, as well as interaction among other species. This leads us to section 3.5, which talks about how communities are dynamic, meaning they are ever changing. They never really stay the same. The idea that dramatic periodic change could be a part of normal ecosystem is relatively new in ecology. This is a new principle, a new understanding that is still being learned by a lot of the ecologists out there. And so we used to consider stability the optimal state of ecosystems, but with more observations and more study, we have learned that communities can be dynamic. And again, they can be changing over time. Sometimes simple changes, sometimes very dramatic. Which leads us to our next question is, are communities organismal or are they individualistic? Well, we've talked about how communities tend to be defined as many species living together to form a community. So, again, we're asking this question: are they organismal or are they individualistic? A man by the name of Henry Chandler Coles proposed that communities develop in a sequence of stages, with the final and longest lasting stage called the climax community. In other words, this is the final stage. F.E. Clemens also felt that this process resembled the maturation of an organism. So we see a variety of ecologists here that have different views. Gleason saw this process as more unpredictable, where species are individualistic, each establishing an environment according to its own ability to colonize, tolerate the environmental conditions, and reproduce there. So of these three different viewpoints, the one that's been adopted the most is Gleason's view, which, again, referring to the community being more individualistic. And this leads us to this term known as succession. Succession is a process in which organisms occupy a site and change into environmental conditions, gradually making way for another type of community. So a good example of this is, looking at us human beings, when we go into a new community that maybe might have not been urbanized or not been mined or anything like that, we change it over time because we start building our houses, we start building other buildings, and this leads to a change in the overall community, which leads to new species coming in and coming in right behind us and changing and modifying the environment as well, whether it be modifying the soil, the light levels, food and water supplies. Okay. This change permits new species to colonize and eventually replace the previous species. And so, a good way of replacing us, for example, would be like if we all chose to move to another area, maybe 10 miles north of here. Well, this place would still be left behind, but it would soon be taken over by another species that will take advantage of what changes we did to this environment. So it's here, we have two terms here: primary succession and secondary succession. In primary succession, bare land is colonized by living organisms where none lived before. Again, a good example of this is like when cities were founded, the first people that lived there were known as primary successors. And secondary succession occurs after a disturbance, when a new community develops from the biological legacy of the previous one. So here we see some ecological successions where it started off as just simple exposed rock, which led to the formation of lichens and mosses, which then led to the formation of grasses, herbs, shrubs, and tree seedlings, and eventually grew to this large forest. And eventually it reaches what we call a climax. It can no longer grow beyond that point. But we see again that it's quite a change over time. And again, you got to remember that this all happens over time. Now, some communities do depend on disturbance. Usually we think of disturbance as being something bad, but in some cases, some communities can only get started when there is a disturbance. And this disturbance, of course, is defined as any force that disrupts the established patterns of species diversity and abundance, community structure, or community properties. Ecologists have found that disturbances like floods and forest fires actually benefit many species, and these types of species are called disturbance-adapted species. For example, certain fish that make their way into new areas because a flood caused a new pond to form or a new lake to form. that is an example of a disturbance-adapted species. And sometimes we have examples of communities that recover very slowly due to disturbances. So here we're looking at the Kingston Plains in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, for example. What happened here was we had a lot of clear-cut logging at the end of the 19th century. People were cutting away at trees, for food, for wood, and for other things here. Now, repeated burning by the pioneers, they hoped to establish farms. They removed a lot of the nutrients from the sandy soil, which left it kind of barren and hard for anything to grow. So this is an example of a disturbance that caused a slow recovery to this area because of all the damage that was done to it. And of course, others can recover quickly. So here we're seeing a different region. We're looking at Yellowstone National Park. And of course, just like in most parts in the West, in California, there is repeated forest fires. And so in this case, we had an entire region that was consumed by fires. But this fire actually produced greater diversity of vegetation after the region was allowed to heal and created more mixed forest types. Which this leads us to our conclusion. And so again, I want you to understand the different principles that we kind of went over this chapter, and that is the concept of evolution, the concept of species interactions, things like competition, predation, symbiosis, and coevolution. And understand that the unique set of organisms and environmental conditions in an ecological community give rise to important properties such as productivity, abundance, diversity, structure, complexity, connectedness, resilience, and succession. These are all important terms, and it's important that we understand this topic of evolution because it leads us to how we're going to cause changes due to what's going on with our environment right now. How are we going to adapt to these changes? For example, recently we've been seeing a lot of changes because of the new administration that's taking place in Washington, D.C. They're not really big believers in the Environmental Protection Agency. I find it kind of rather ironic that the new secretary of the EPA is a man who has sued the EPA 12 times and whose sole goal is to get rid of the EPA. So I don't know why they would put that man in charge of it. But recently we saw a bill pass where it allowed coal miners to dump waste into nearby streams when before that it was prohibited. And so we're going to see how we're going to adapt to that, how we're going to adapt to the change in the water conditions and the region. A lot of it is going to be based on understanding the concepts of evolution and species interaction and how they all work together. Okay. Well, again, thank you all for listening to this longer chapter than what we're used to, but hopefully from here on out we will be going through one chapter at a time every time we view a video. Thank you, and you all have a great day.